Hey everyone, welcome in to our Civil War continuation, where tonight the focus is going to be on political aspects of the Civil War. And one of the aspects that I want to really get into today is the way that Congress was able to maneuver and pass a series of laws and legislation without the presence of all those Southerners who had fled to the South during the Confederacy, the secession. Now, keep in mind, there was one representative that stayed, and his name was Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. More on him later. But I brought out the trusty whiteboard here, and I'm going to be going through a series of important discussion points. And the first is these radical Republicans. That is a really important term to keep in mind with not only the Civil War Congress, but also Congress after the Civil War, which we'll be talking about next week. The radical Republicans were Republicans who seized the opportunity to take advantage of the Confederates being gone. The radical Republicans were, as you can imagine, extreme Republicans. They were looking to end slavery. They were in favor of the war, in favor of the draft. They passed the Enrollment Act. They helped Lincoln with habeas corpus. But I want to talk more about three important acts that the radical Republicans passed that were unrelated to the Civil War. And these often get overlooked. But the one name to keep an eye out for, as he was sort of the leader of the radical Republicans in Congress, and his name was Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens. Another radical Republican who you could list here, and he's not on the board, was Charles Sumner. Remember, he was the guy that got beaten by Preston Brooks with a cane on the Senate floor? Charles Sumner was definitely a radical Republican as well. So these were Republicans in Congress that were looking to push Republican programs without the South there in Congress. Three programs that the radical Republicans passed, and all three share a common theme of westward expansion. You could argue that these radical Republicans were big supporters of Manifest Destiny. The first program is the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad was an act passed by Congress to build a railroad that traversed the entire United States. Leaving from the Midwest around St. Louis, plans were that the federal government was going to build a railroad that connected the entire country. There would be two lines of railroads coming from the middle of the United States, the Central Pacific line, and then there would be a line on the West Coast going from west to east, and that would be the Union Pacific line. And these two railroad lines were to be built, and they would meet eventually in the middle, and they would forge, for the very first time in American history, a transcontinental railroad. This was an ambitious project, an engineering feat that would be unmatched and unrivaled in American history up to this point. After we're done with the Civil War, we actually will spend time talking about the Transcontinental Railroad. It's a beautiful story for us to talk about. But for now, I want you to realize that the radical Republicans took advantage of the war and the lack of Southerners to promote Manifest Destiny and to promote the growth of the United States, even as there was a war being fought. The railroad wouldn't be finished until the end of the 1860s, but Congress gave it the green light. They earmarked money and funds for this project to be built. A second law passed by Congress, or a piece of legislation passed by Congress that dealt with westward expansion, was the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was basically an act of legislation that ensured that land in the West would be sold cheaply. This allowed for people to buy land at a cheap rate. It's similar to what Thomas Jefferson had done in his presidency, in which Jefferson reduced the cost of land to promote more settlers for his agrarian vision. So the Homestead Act was passed to give people opportunities to buy cheap homes in the West. And these homes were known as homesteaders. So you bought a homestead, and the people that went out there were known as homesteaders. And so they were going to be a big part of the post-Civil War spread of the United States to the West. The last law I want to talk about is the Morrill Land-Grant Act. This was a land grant act which the federal government gave states money for states to settle and build universities primarily on in their state territories. The Morrill Land-Grant Act, and I have a map here I'm going to show you, was a really wonderful addition to the westward expansion and Manifest Destiny theme because it made sure that universities were going to be built eventually with federal money in new territories and in new states. And the Morrill Land-Grant Act continued for many decades. In fact, that's why the University of Arizona, for example, right down there in Tucson, below us, was built with money from the Morrill Land-Grant Act. And on the map, you'll see all these big colleges that we've heard of. These are all public schools, which means they were taxpayer money was being used to build these schools. So 3 acts, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Land-Grant Act were all initiatives, whoops, I almost dropped the board, were all initiatives passed by the radical Republicans who took advantage of Congress being emptied out of Southerners. But again, except for one guy, and that was Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson, who was this guy? During the war, he served a vital role for the Union. Despite being a Southerner from Tennessee, he actually supported the Union. He was loyal to the Union. And after the Union Army liberated Tennessee from the Confederacy, Andrew Johnson served as the military commander. He sort of oversaw as like sort of a governor of Tennessee, which was once it was liberated from the Confederacy. But Johnson was an interesting figure, and he played a vital role in Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign of 1864. Because Johnson was chosen to be Lincoln's running mate as a Republican, even though Johnson himself was not a Republican, because Johnson had appeal in the border states, and because Johnson had appeal in the South, the theory was Lincoln would be able to broaden his political net. He would broaden his appeal to states that otherwise maybe wouldn't like Lincoln. And Lincoln, I have to tell you, was very nervous going into the election of 1864. He was extremely nervous because Lincoln worried that as the war dragged on and battles like Gettysburg, claiming 50-something thousand casualties, were only going to make Lincoln more and more unpopular. So there were a lot of people in the Republican Party who thought Lincoln was done for. There was panic that Lincoln had really lost his edge, that he was not going to be able to win election in 1864. And despite his best efforts with the Gettysburg Address and everything that Lincoln had done during the war, Lincoln was on the ropes. There was really concern that Lincoln was going to lose the election. And the challenger for Lincoln was extremely interesting. And challenging Lincoln, the Democrats chose George McClellan. And if you remember, George McClellan was the head of the Union Army at the Battle of Antietam. And Lincoln, remember, went down to Antietam and fired McClellan because he was too slow and too hesitant to chase after Robert E. Lee after the Union won the battle. Well, the Democrats and the Copperheads that were against the war chose McClellan, hoping that McClellan would be able to upset Lincoln in the election and restore the Democrats to the White House for the first time since the 1850s. However, the Democrats' plan to run McClellan, it didn't work out very well. Lincoln won the election in a landslide in the electoral votes. Lincoln won 91% of the electoral votes, as you can see on the map. 91%, only 9% for McClellan. But look at how well McClellan did in the popular vote. That debunks the myth that Abraham Lincoln was this overwhelmingly popular guy that we've been talking about. Notice, too, West Virginia. Okay, what's up with West Virginia? Where'd they come from? Well, West Virginia broke away from Virginia during the war and was admitted into the Union as a free state. West Virginia was not involved. I mean, if you think of West Virginia today, it's very much a coal mining area. They don't have a lot of farming there, so West Virginia didn't have as much slavery as the rest of Virginia. So West Virginia more allied with the Union, and so they formed their own state in 1863. McClellan won 3 states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky, and that shouldn't come as a surprise that he won Delaware and Kentucky, considering those are border states. So there we have it, and what we're really going to focus on tomorrow is, with Lincoln now back in the White House, how does the North try to win the war? And that's going to be what we talk about, the end of the war. The strategy in the North is going to shift, and they're going to turn the war into a war of attrition. They're going to wear the South down, and they're going to take the fight to the South now to try to end the Civil War by Christmas of 1864, which will not happen. And that's going to lead to more casualties, more bloodshed, more controversy. This is not ending anytime soon, and it's not going to be a pretty ending. But we'll finish the Civil War tomorrow, and I want to make sure we get a chance, if we don't finish today, to read the Gettysburg Address. So hope you guys have enjoyed tonight. The pictures and then the whiteboard stuff should help. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Tuesday. The past shapes the future. Have a good day, everyone.